My guest in the Nimataion today is Douglas Batchelor, and together we're spinning a yarn. Douglas, you're the host of one of the most wonderful magic podcasts out there. What magic is this?
Thank
General
you.
magic nerd. Great to have you.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me on, Barnard. And I was perusing your channel in the time since you asked me to be on the show, and I just love what you do. It's fantastic. So many great stories. My podcast, I've always been like, I want to tell more stories, and so you've got the whole story front covered. It's wonderful. So thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm excited.
Great, wonderful. So, what has been your favorite story as a child?
So I'm going to tell a little story before the story. And this is not to make me sound like somewhat better than people, but I actually learned to read very young. My mother was she had a master's degree in early childhood education. So she made us read and learn to read much earlier than other children did. And so by the time I was in like grade school, I had access to the library there. And I figured out how to use the library, how to find certain things. And it might have been a combination of, you know, my love for like Halloween and my love of like things like the Ghostbusters, which I was close to picking the Ghostbusters, but it was like it's not truly in there. But suffice to say, all of this, by the time I was in grade one, I was taking out lots of books about ghosts. I loved ghost stories. And I loved stories of like hauntings and like the paranormal and the supernatural. I'll say that. And so I was very enamored with a author by the name of Daniel Cohen, who, if you were to look up his Wikipedia page or go to Goodreads and look him up, the guy wrote over 200 books, like just so many books, and not all of them kids' books, but a lot of them were kids' books. And the library that I went to, which was it was a school outside of a Canadian city, rural, but for some reason they had a lot of books on ghosts and the paranormal, strangely enough. And so I would take these all out. But the reason I'm saying this is because there was a particular kind of ghost story that I absolutely loved, and this was called the Screaming Skulls. Do you know anything about Screaming Skulls?
Not really.
No? Okay. So they are a very particular kind of like folklore from England. They're pretty much only in England. And they seem to all follow the same kind of trajectory in which there is a person, something bad happens to this person. Their skull is supposed to like stay in a certain place. If the skull is moved from this certain place, it causes complete chaos in the areas around it. People die, livestock die, storms, things go to crap until the skull is put back to where it needs to be. And for some reason, from such an early age, and I remember it because it was tough. When you asked me to pick one story, I was like, man, what is the story to pick? Because there's so many. Do I just say Star Wars? Do I say Ghostbuster? But when I thought about it, it's like I, for some reason, was obsessed with reading about screaming skulls because there's about 32 to 30 to 40 of these stories from England, and it's only in England where these stories come from, England and Scotland. And I would just try to find as much out about these screaming skulls as possible. I don't know why they were so interesting to me. My uncle, who on my mother's side was really fascinated with skulls, and I was always very fascinated by skulls. And for some reason, the story of a skull that has some kind of like a revenge function if it should be moved was very, very cool to me. So for some reason, these stories, I loved ghosts and I
Hmm.
loved hauntings, but skulls that haunt and cause mischief, that to me was the most cool thing. So when you ask me like what story was really important to me, for some reason these ghost stories were, because I think they tick a lot of the boxes of the things that I'm still that I have always been interested in, and that's like ghosts, a bit of folklore, a bit of mythology, um, almost tales of a kind of interior or agency to objects, even those like remains of human beings. It just, yeah, it's the one story when I think about it, it's like that story. These stories have kind of been with me throughout my entire life, and yeah, it's the Screaming Skull stories that I just find I love them. I think they're great.
Wonderful. Yeah, 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 yeah. A lot comes to mind, but before I go into that, do you have a skull on your desk or on your altar or something like that?
I don't have an actual human's skull, but if you look at my place, I have skulls everywhere. I just love, yeah, I've like it's kind of a bit much, and it's actually less because I just moved from one place to another part of the country, and I gifted some of my skull like artwork to friends before I left, but my previous place, it was just, yeah, I had skulls everywhere. So
I thought so.
yeah.
Sounds like it.
Oh, all up top, there's skulls, and there's, yeah. You're never too far away from a skull from where I am. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect icon of all this you mentioned, the supernatural, the animated objects, and I'm reminded of, don't know, have you read Joshua Cutchin's latest book, Ecology of Souls? Yeah,
it's pretty much my favorite thing that I've read in years. It's maybe one of
absolutely
the greatest things ever. Yeah,
amazing, amazing. He did such wonderful work, and the last chapter is about headlessness, and
yes,
yeah, yeah. I thought when, during the whole time I read this book, I thought you have to go into headlessness, and then in the last chapter he went there, and
yeah.
that's interesting because you said it's in England and Scotland, because they're the Celts and their head cult there, and there's this story I love. I love the Mabinogi, the Welsh mythology, and there is told the story of King Bran, who got his head chopped off, and the head is on in a certain place and tells stories.
It's
Um,
great.
uh,
Great.
long after he's dead, and that's where the Tower of London is now. And as long as this head of Bran is there,
It's right.
it's safe. So
It's
that's
right.
the same mythology.
Exactly.
You
Exactly.
mustn't move it. It's just
And what's cool is that these places, they actually do, you can find pictures of these skulls, and they're actually there. And I find it fascinating now with me and my podcast is because like I think magic has a real history. I think it's got a true, I think a lot of what's interesting about the history of magic is that a lot of it has been the history of the occult as it exists now has been occulted a bit by the 19th century, I think, in 19th century occultism. But with my podcast, I'm always trying to find this real history of the occult, which I think is very, very important. But that requires actually like doing this tightrope act of like, well, what's mythology and folklore, and what is actually something that has happened. And so it's really tough to thread that needle. And what I think with something like the Screaming Skulls, which interesting because in anticipation for looking for doing this episode, I was kind of like looking back at some of my earlier notes and things that I've been looking at. There's this idea. Well, then where did these tales of Screaming Skulls come from? And you brought it up as well that there was this idea of the Celtic head cults and stuff like this, and that this headless worship that would existed in Celtic countries. And there was an article done in 1999 about, is this where these folk tales of Screaming Skulls come from? And then there was these other ideas that they keep kind of accruing around this folk tale of these skulls. But when people actually go and date these skulls, a lot of them are from like the 16th century, which isn't as old as a lot of the stories they're said to come from, right? A lot of the stories, they say that they come from like the 17th or the 18th century, sometimes even before that. One skull in particular, they say it comes from like pre-Christian Britain. Like it's one of the skulls is super old, but it was said to have belonged to a slave from the West Indies when they were brought to England, and he died and he wanted his remains to go back to the West Indies. But of course, they just put his body in a churchyard, and it caused a great deal of chaos. That is the probably the prototypical Screaming Skull story. But that skull actually is from pre-Christian Britain, that particular one. The rest of them, though, they're from the 16th century. So what's interesting to me is that these folklore and this tale, this not false history, but certainly ahistorical stories have surrounded these heads that are there. They're in the walls and in staircases and in the kitchen of these houses in England. But what actually was happening in the 16th century that made people want to keep these skulls? Why were people just keeping skulls around? And I think that we will never know. But to me, what's interesting is that there is some kind of thing that was happening that is lost to time that made people want to keep the heads of people who were dying around, whether it was the fact that, Protestantism in England was starting to come in, and the relics of Catholicism were starting to fall away. Were people trying to keep some part of this practice alive by keeping skulls of their dead loved ones around? We will never know, but it's always so fascinating to me, and it's so strange that when I think back, what story was the biggest influence? It's for some reason it's this very specific English folk tale of the Screaming Skull.
Wonderful, wonderful. I mean, for me, stories living beings.
Yes,
And,
yes,
and they procreate using us.
that's right.
And so this is a very old story, and it's using us both now to
That's right.
go on. And I wonder, have you ever used one or several of your skulls for magical purposes? Did you
I have,
divinate?
yes. So there's a certain kind of divination that is done by a skull, and it can be done with some people use actual human skulls and things like that, but it can be done with plastic. I use clay. I have skull. So here's another story. My mother used to live in Mexico, and she lived in a place where the Day of the Dead celebrations are huge. It's the biggest in Mexico. It's a place called Michoacan. And there's a town very close to where she was called uh, Capula, which is where they do all of the like decorations for the Day of the Dead and all of the clay. They all a lot of them come from this place. It's known for its artwork for skulls. So you can find these figures of skulls and I always like, every time I go there, I always pick up 3 or 4 of them and bring them back. But yes, I have my skulls, although not human, they still do the trick.
Yeah.
Put it that way.
Great. Sorry to interrupt. Capula, is it connected to caput, Latin for the head?
No, I don't believe so. No, it's Capula was actually it had its name from the Puripecha first, like the people who were originally there before Spain. So yes, so it goes back before the Spanish.
Okay, okay. No etymology. Okay.
Unfortunately.
Would you like to tell how you did your divination work with the skull?
So basically what you do with claromancy, or it's not claromancy. I forget the actual technical term for doing divination via skull, is basically you just like you're running your fingers around the actual surface, and it basically tells you, it's kind of like mapping like a feeling through the lines of the skull, which is interesting because these are clay objects that I'm using, right? And so it's a form of doing divination, and it's supposed to be specific to like human skulls. But something else that I do is that I, with the embodiment of using skulls, something that I picked up briefly from a gentleman by the name of Giulio Cesar Odi, who did a book called Magister Officiorum. He uses the Ars Goetia, which is like everybody's favorite spirit conjuring text, but he would use bird skulls, and he would draw the sigils of the spirits from the Ars Goetia on that, and he would keep those in a brazen vessel. And so that's something else that I would do with these small little figurines of skulls that I had. Is instead of using bird skulls, I would just use these clay figurines and put the sigils on them and keep those, because you can find skulls all over like the area where my mother lived, and they're just small little figurines, and I would just write the little sigil on them, and those would kind of be, in a way, like the calling card of the specific spirits within the Ars Goetia.
So you invited or invoked the spirit in the skull, and then by feeling your fingertips around the spirit.
That's a totally separate thing. So I kind of compacted two together. But I see. The divination via skull is something that's completely different than what Giulio and was doing with the Ars Goetia, which is and hit the brazen vessel within there.
Okay. I see. Yeah. Wonderful. And as it happens, I think it just wanted to be in the picture. That's the skull of a mountain lion. It's one of my power animals, and he just told me, just put me on screen. Like,
nice.
Hello.
Mountain lions, where I grew up in Alberta, we had mountain lion problems. They would always be around, and they would be killing like neighbors' dogs and stuff like that. And very, very amazing animal. The mountain lions and cougars, and they're a wonderful animal. And I used to volunteer at a zoo, so I used to cut up food for them. I'm not kidding. My goodness. Yeah, it's weird.
Did you feed them as well?
So you don't like feed them by hand. You have
you have to with the stick, and because they have to jump or something like that.
I never did that because I was a volunteer. The zookeepers got to do that. I would just cut up their food and then put it in a bucket, and then the zookeepers would feed them. But I didn't get to feed the mountain lions. I just got to cut their food up, which was I didn't mind it. A lot of people were kind of like, I don't like, because they would actually feed them roadkill. Roadkill from the Rockies. They would get brought to the Calgary Zoo, and then it would feed the animals there.
Yeah. But that's another story for another day.
Yes, so many stories today.
I love it how stories birth new stories or lead to new stories nested within them. Douglas, thank you so much for being on the show. It has been a great pleasure. And I hope we talk again soon.
Definitely. And this has been so much fun. And thank you so much for just have me rack my brain as to what my favorite stories were. It was so much fun to try and think of what was the one that has been with me the longest and is kind of emblematic of what I'm doing now. And so thank you for that process.
Thank you. Interesting how stories shape our personalities. Yeah.
Very much so.
So have a great day. See you soon. The world is magical.
The world is magical. Thanks again, Bernard.